in those days. Now they're called cryptologic technicians. So we were all sort of part of the same family, so we were all very distressed when we heard that the ship was attacked, especially with so many people. And a lot of the people that I worked with knew a number of the people that were on the ship. So ever since then, I've had a fond relationship with the Liberty Veterans Association. So after I got out of the Navy, I used the GI Bill to go to law school, graduated from law school, and I wanted to be a writer as opposed to a lawyer. So I started looking for ideas to write about, and nobody had ever done a book on NSA before, so I thought that's a good topic, and so I wrote a book on the National Security Agency, the very first one. It was called The Puzzle Palace. And it was a very big bestseller, which was very nice, but it was also somewhat hazardous because the government threatened me twice with prosecution for writing it. However, I didn't break any laws, so they couldn't come after me. Although they did threaten me several times. They said I violated a number of laws by writing about it, but the laws they said I broke were sorry? Oh, yeah, okay. You're a genius if you've got a working law. Okay, well, there I am.
Maybe your finger don't be just moving along.
Yeah, let me just see. Before we marry, I'll do it, or you can just do it on the
Yeah, let's tap the screen. Throw something at me.
Yeah, anyway, that was me in 1964 joining the U.S. Navy. Yeah, let me do the next one. Do this real quickly. Yeah, like I said, I was assigned to Naval Security Group headquarters in the Pacific. That was our headquarters. It was the same one that was there during World War II. That's what I did in the spare time, fish and ride on a motorcycle. It was a really good time.
James, excuse me. Can you pull the mic out?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we go on the next one. I can go these fairly fast. Yeah, so anyway, like I said, after the Navy, I went to law school. It wasn't me, but it's representative of how I felt in law school. The next one. Thank you. And my first book was The Puzzle Palace, a report on NSA, America's most secret agency, and I wrote about the USS Liberty on that book. That was one that they threatened with prosecution on. My next book, ironically, they threatened me with prosecution on Puzzle Palace. When I wrote Body of Secrets, I had a whole chapter on the Liberty in there, really quite a extensive chapter. And I think they sort of gave up, so they invited the director of NSA, invited my wife and I to his house for dinner. So that was quite a change from going to jail to going to dinner with the director. But I like the latter part better. It was a lot more fun. Next slide, thanks. So after I wrote the book, The Puzzle Palace, it was the first time anybody ever written seriously, except for Jim Ennis, who was one of my heroes for writing a book on the Liberty. But it was the first time sort of an independent writer had written about the Liberty. So I had to do a lot of interviews, and among the interviews I did was with our old friend there, Judge Jay Crystal. Anybody not know who he is? Yeah. So yeah, there I am with Wolf Blitzer. I didn't know at the time, but in my most recent book that just came out last year, I wrote about Wolf a little bit and the job he had before he went to CNN, which was being the flack for AIPAC. He published the newsletter for AIPAC. He was like the lead propagandist for AIPAC. So you can see I wasn't too happy there. So I was defending the Liberty, but that's what I like doing. Next slide. And then I got invited to be part of the panel at the State Department where they had a panel on the Liberty, and it's like 5 people against 1 there. Crystal was there, a bunch of a guy from Israel and so forth. So it was Yeah, it was a challenging debate. And next slide. And among the people that was there was Joe Lantini, one of the crew members who was in the audience. There were a number of crew members in the audience, but they were never invited to be on the panel. I mean, I was invited to be on the panel, but I wasn't a crew member. So Joe Lantini was, and he tried to speak afterwards to ask a question, and they basically just shut him up. So that's your State Department in operation. Okay, next one. And then when I was with ABC News, I was the investigative producer for Peter Jennings. I was the investigative producer handling most of the overseas activity, and I covered Israel, and I was over there a number of times. And one of the assignments over there was to find this guy that was a murderer in the United States. He killed a woman with a bomb. He was Jewish, so he fled to Israel and hid out there. And then I went over there, I found him. That's him there on the left with his Uzi machine gun. And so we had a hidden camera. We shot him, the hidden camera there. And we followed him to an army base. I mean, even though he was wanted for murder in the United States, the Israelis put him in their army. And so we went back. I followed him to his army base, and we went back to his home in Kiryat Arba in the occupied territory, and we started to shoot the house. We actually took the camera out of the car because we knew he was at a military base. And then a guy came out with a Uzi machine gun and started firing at us. And it fired over our heads, but we had it all on camera, which is what you really want. So when we did this show back in, when we got back to the U.S., there was a huge outcry in the U.S. over our story because, you know, he was a murderer. He was wanted in the United States for murdering an American in California. And the Israelis were basically giving him asylum. So after we did our story, then finally the U.S. State Department sent an extradition request to get him back. And Israel finally agreed to it, and they put him in prison for like 3 years. And then fighting extradition, finally he was extradited to the United States. Went to prison, or went to trial in California, was found guilty of first-degree murder, sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. The only problem with that is 30 years expires in a couple weeks, and he's got parole. So I'm going in hiding in the next couple of weeks here, since I put him in there for 30 years. But happy I did. Okay, next slide. So my last book just came out last year. My fifth book was called Spy Fail. And it looks at the failure of U.S. intelligence, or the FBI basically, to find spies in the U.S. And a lot of the book, or at least 25%, maybe more, is devoted to Israel and how we have so many Israeli spies in the United States doing all kinds of covert operations and so forth. And nobody ever gets arrested. Americans get arrested occasionally for working with them, like Pollard and so forth, but the Israelis themselves never ever get arrested. So in that book, which came out January of last year, I wrote a lot about how this is all developing and how a lot of it is developing on college campuses, which was, I was glad I wrote it because 9 months later everything exploded in Gaza. So now I write for the Nation, and I write on Israel and Gaza and all this stuff that's going on over there. And I've been focusing a great deal on the whole issue of Israeli influence in the United States and Israeli involvement in U.S. campuses. I wrote this one on the attack in at UCLA, where the pro-Palestinian protesters were attacked violently by a pro-Israeli group that I wrote a lot about. Okay, next slide. So this is why I'm really here. That's sort of background, but this is what I really wanted to talk about. I talked about the attack numerous times, numerous debates on numerous TV shows, and numerous books, and numerous articles, and I spoke about it last year. So I'm moving on to a different topic, and that's how do we get there? This is the rise and fall of America's SIGINT Navy. In other words, the Navy, like the Liberty that goes out there and eavesdrops on countries. Next slide. The reason we had that was because the communist world was pretty heavily covered with listening posts. Anybody here recognize these things? They're called Willow-Weber antennas or elephant cages. We put them in a lot of places, Turkey, a lot of places around the Soviet Union, so we eavesdrop on the Soviet Union, Eastern and Russia, Soviet Union, China, Eastern Europe, and so forth. So we had that pretty well covered. Those are dots on the globe there, where we have Willow-Weber antennas and different kinds of eavesdropping, looking for foreign ships and so forth. So the problem was there was hardly anything covering South America and Africa. So the idea was to come up with ships that you could sail down there and spy on those two major continents. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, is this better? So anyway, we had a lot of coverage of the communist world up there. We didn't have any coverage of the southern continent, the southern hemisphere. That was the idea of building these ships, like the Liberty. But there was a lot of debate between the NSA, which ran eavesdropping, basically. I mean, it was like a huge agency that had a lot of power, and the Navy, which ran the ships. So putting those two together was very complicated. Next slide. So the guy that was in charge of running the seagoing espionage, seagoing eavesdropping world was a guy named Frank Raven, who I spent time with for the Puzzle Labs. And he was head of what was known as G Group at NSA. That was the whole world except for the communist world. So in other words, he was interested in South America and Africa. And he said I was probably the father of it being the seagoing eavesdropping fleet. It was one of the first projects that I started when I got to G Group. What we wanted was a slow tub that was civilian, that could mosey along the coast relatively slowly, and take its time to see. What the model was Russian trawlers. Russia had all these trawlers. They were old, rusty buckets. I mean, there was this ugly little ships. Had no fishing nets, but they did have lots of antennas, and they put them off Norfolk or San Diego and places in international waters. And just listen. So that was the idea. That's what NSA had originally thought of as these seagoing eavesdropping ships. That's what the model was. Those are the Russian trawlers. not very handsome, but they did the trick. I mean, you got the antennas, you got the receivers, and they collected what they could pick up. Next slide. So what happened was we created this fleet. Again, the NSA had a lot of input into what kind of ships to do. So originally they wanted these civilian ships, so they were called USNS. So they weren't technically run by the Department of the Navy. They were run by Military Sea Transportation Authority or whatever. And so they were civilian, they were unarmed, they looked innocent, you know. They just sail along the coast and nobody knows they were really spying. That was sort of the whole idea. So we had that fleet, original fleet of the USNS Valdez and a few others. Next one. And so there was the Jamestown and the Oxford. Those were the first two. And the Oxford was sent to Cuba That's where we did most of the spying on Cuba, even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was right off the coast. I mean, not too far off the coast, but it was off the coast. And so we had the USS Oxford was the first of the spy ships. It was targeted to South America and Cuba. The Jamestown was another spy ship, and that was focused on Southeast Asia. Next one. And then you have the USS Liberty. So the Navy didn't like the idea of civilian ships. They didn't like the idea of unarmed ships. So that was where the NSA and the Navy had a lot of differences. And so this fleet of ships was created. And the Liberty was, like I said, launched it was launched in 1964. And it was assigned to eavesdrop off Africa. Next one. So the Valdez was crawling up the east coast of Africa very slowly, listening to all the coups and everything else taking place. And then the Liberty was going up the west coast and doing the same thing, just eavesdropping and picking up signals. Next slide. In the spring of 1967, the USS Liberty arrived off West Africa for its 5th patrol. And, normally it was supposed to just sort of go down there and come back up. But at the same time, there was the trouble that was developing in the Middle East. So on May 22nd of 1967, the Liberty was pulled out of, on May 22nd, it was in Abidjan, capital of Côte d'Ivoire, or Ivory Coast, for a 4-day port call. Next slide. But that's when all the trouble was brewing in the Middle East, and when the Mediterranean was starting to get very active with warships and so forth. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff really were interested in finding out what was going on in Egypt and Israel, or particularly Egypt. They weren't really too interested in Israel, but they were interested in what was going on in Egypt, particularly whether there were any Soviet troops there. So, next slide. So the decision was made to send the Liberty to monitor the war. And Frank Raven, who again was chief of G Group, which was in charge of, largely in charge of the seagoing spy fleet, argued that it was too risky to send the ship. I mean, because it looks like a warship, had guns on it and everything. It wasn't, it looks like a warship, so it was kind of dangerous to send it very close to the war zone. So he argued that the ship would be very defenseless there. War breaks out, she'll be alone and vulnerable. Either side might start shooting at her. So I say the ship should be left where it is, which was in Abidjan. But then he was overruled. Next slide. So all of a sudden the Liberty gets an emergency message to get ready to sail, but as soon as possible. And within hours, it took off from Abidjan, and it was headed to Rota, Spain, where it was going to get refueled and so forth. Next slide. I always thought this comment was pretty funny. This is Frank Raven again. He says, NSA had originally wanted to also put Hebrew linguists on the ship, but NSA didn't have enough. I mean, God, said Frank Raven, you're manning a crisis. Where are you going to get these linguists from? Go out and ask the nearest synagogue? So we didn't have any Hebrew linguists on the ship. 8 days after leaving Abidjan, the Liberty arrived in Rota, Spain, to pick up supplies and fuel in Russian linguists. Next slide. Now, in the meantime, the Valdez, which was entering its cruise on the east coast of Africa, and it was heading back to the U.S. So what they decided to do, and again, the Valdez didn't look like a spy ship. It was the NSA sort of version of a spy ship. And so they had the Valdez sail up through the Suez Canal and then slowly go across the Mediterranean, the same area that the Liberty was going to go in. And it was doing what was known as a hearability study. In other words, where is the best place to hear from? And you know, when you're doing this kind of thing, there are ducts, there are sound goes up and it comes down in strange places a lot of times. So that's what it did, was it was going through there, listening to see where the best place was to pick up signals. NSA was only interested in high-level communications, what generals and colonels and military commands were saying. They found that the best place was off Crete. There was a duct in the air where they could get this sound. So Frank Raven said, well, that's what we'll put. We'll put the ship in off Crete, and it'll just pick up the signals there. And so, you know, that was the decision. Next slide. But the Joint Chiefs of Staff had other ideas. The ship was refueled in Rota, and among the things they picked up in Rota was that hearability study across the Mediterranean to find out where the best place was to listen. And so without notifying NSA, the JCS ordered McGonigal, the captain, to deploy off the coast of Israel and Egypt, but not to approach closer than 12 and a half nautical miles to Egypt and 6.5 to Israel. And then after they did some repairs and took on Russian linguists, the ship sailed from Rota heading towards the war zone. Next slide. So as the war began, the Navy sent out a warning notice to all ships and aircraft in the area to keep at least 100 nautical miles away from the coast of Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Egypt. The Liberty was on an espionage mission, so unless specifically ordered to change course, the commander, McGonigal, would continue steaming at full speed towards the Egyptian coast. Next slide. But it was not until the morning of June 7th that an analyst ran into Frank Raven's office at NSA and asked him credulously, God's sake, do you know where the Liberty is? And at the time, Raven thought it was sitting off the east coast of Crete in Greece, which was the original plan. So they went crazy at NSA, saying, what's the ship doing there? By then, the Liberty was only about 10 hours from the scheduled patrol off a dozen miles off the Egyptian Sinai Desert. Next slide. So at this point, Raven orders a major complaint. They're basically running this. It's not the Navy, it's the NSA. The way this works is NSA runs this, and the Navy runs the ships. They're the captains, but they take the orders from NSA. It's the same way when the eavesdropping planes are flying, the pilots don't say where they're going. NSA says where the pilots are supposed to be flying these things. So that was the same issue here, so Raven makes a major complaint to the Pentagon, and then they agree with him. Let's go to the next slide. So as a result of the new concerns, the Pentagon, or the JCS, sends out a new high-priority message, now requiring that the Liberty not approach closer than 100 miles to the coast of Egypt. But due to a number of screw-ups, having spent 3 years in the Navy, I understand that I'm very familiar with screw-ups. So that message never arrived, and so the Liberty continued on its way. Next slide. About 4 hours later, 5:14 a.m. on Thursday, June 8th, 600 miles away from nearest help, that's when John Scott, the duty officer, noticed a flying boxcar making several circles over the Liberty and then flying back to Tel Aviv. And that's when the attack took place, which I've spoken about numerous times, and we all know what happened. So, next slide. So after all that, long before the Liberty was ever attacked, the Navy had become disenchanted with the entire NSA seagoing program because they were looking at themselves as being just sort of hired hands from NSA. The Navy personnel have become little more than seagoing chauffeurs and hired hands for the NSA. And again, I spent a lot of time interviewing people at NSA, and I'm sort of the world's expert on NSA at this point. So that was the feeling at NSA. So there was this huge battle between NSA and the Navy over what to do with these ships. So the bottom line was that the Navy said, well, fine, we're going to make our own fleet of spy ships. And then we'll run them, and then we'll do whatever we want with them, and we're not going to take all your orders from NSA. Next slide. So, like I said, they began laying out these ambitious plans for their own signals intelligence fleet. Admiral there, we talked once about having small intelligence gathering ships, 200 of them, said one Navy admiral. And chosen as a maiden vessel for the Navy's own spy fleet was the USS Banner and the USS Pueblo. But they were just minor ships compared to the Liberty. But that was the whole idea. They were supposed to look like Russian trawlers, just not like they're eavesdropping ships at all. Next slide. But about 7 months after the Liberty, the ship I worked on, or I didn't work on it, but the ship we were controlling from my office in Hawaii was captured by the North Koreans. The North Koreans sailed up there and attacked the ship. One sailor was killed, and they basically kidnapped the entire ship. They forced the ship into a port in North Korea. They kept the crew in prison for about a year. Unlike Israel, they didn't attack the ship and kill everybody. They tried to kill everybody and blow up the ship. At least they just captured the ship and put the people in a sort of it wasn't really a prison, but it was a sort of a hotel that they watched. And that went on for about a year. And then the Navy said, we've had it, we lost 2 ships within the last year, a lot of crew members and so forth, so the NSA and the Navy gave up on the spy fleet, and that was the end of it. However, there is one still remaining Navy SIGINT ship still on the rolls, on active on the rolls. Next slide. And if you ever happen to go to Pyongyang, you can actually get a guided tour of it. The Liberty is now sitting as a tourist attraction in the not the Liberty, the Pueblo is now sitting as a tourist attraction in Pyongyang harbor there. And that nice young lady will give you a tour of the ship and show you all its capabilities and so forth. So there we are. That's the last remaining member of the U.S. Navy and NSA SIGINT ship. What happened after that was the Navy would take large ships, destroyers and so forth, and they put vans on them. They look like big trailers, you see at a trailer park or something, except they're very heavily armed and everything. So all the CTs and the eavesdropping personnel would sit in there, and then when their tour was over or whatever, they went along whatever coast they were going, they'd sail back and the crane would take it off and put it on another ship going someplace else. But that was sort of the end of the fleet, and that's also the end of my talk. So I appreciate it, and I do want to thank this brilliant person here who was able to do what I couldn't do. I can tell you everything about NSA and how the technology works, but I can't get a slide machine to work. So, okay. Yeah, but I'm happy to take any kind of questions if you have. Yes, sir.
Hey, James, thank you for coming here and speaking like you did last year. You're famous for collecting all the quotes of the highest level members of the United States military and State Department and NSA who were all convinced the attack on the Liberty was intentional.
Right.
There's tons of them. I just want to give you one more. If you just go to Bobby Ray Edmonds' Wikipedia page, you can add another one. He's very public about saying the attack on the Liberty was Israeli intentionally attacking an American ship. I just wanted to give that to you.
Well, when did he say that? Was that
He's been saying it for decades.
I guess Bobby Inman and I don't get along. He once threatened me with holding NSA hostage when I just graduated from law school. I was trying to write a book. He was a little overreaction, but again, he was the guy that threatened me with prosecution twice. So I don't get along with Bobby Inman too well. But I've interviewed former directors at NSA, Marshall Carter, Pat Carter. I spent 3 days with him. He was director of NSA at the time the Liberty was attacked. He's absolutely convinced it was deliberate. His deputy was also convinced. Lou Tordella. He wrote on the Israeli investigation, a nice whitewash. I interviewed the head of the sort of operations department of NSA, and he was also adamant. You know, I wrote all these things, and I wrote them I wrote some of it in Body of Secrets. Well, I wrote some of it in Puzzle Palestine and Body of Secrets. And Richard Helms, who was director of the CIA at the time, he hadn't said anything about any of that. And I never really even approached him because I figured he hadn't said anything, he's probably not going to say anything. So after my book came out, he actually called me up and said, I'd like to get together with you for lunch. So I sat down with Richard Helms, and he said, you got everything completely right in your book there on the Liberty. It was definitely deliberate and everything. So I've interviewed so many people. I haven't had anybody say that it was an accident, which is what the Israeli position is. So it was, everywhere I've gone, I've always relied on the people who were there at the time, who were the people who were running the intelligence services, and they all say it was deliberate. So I've gotten a lot of flack, obviously, because of that, but that's why I'm in this business, because I like dealing with adversity at different times.
Yes, Jim. I remember when I was at the State Department with you.
Oh, you were there, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And they cut us off in the kangaroo court. He was the only supporter. The rest of them were all, well, Michael Oring for one.
Right.
AJ, all of them were against everybody. They promised us, Mark Susser, that we could all speak. They'd give us time. And when they cut Joe off, and I was going to get up, and they said, let him speak, and he says, it's over. And you remember that, don't you, very well?
Yeah, I was one of those few people up there saying, or the only person up there saying, let these guys speak, because I wasn't on the ship, but these guys were.
And I know you did. And Ward Boston's declaration, you read right there, and that knocked them backwards.
Right, they didn't know that was coming.
I know they didn't.
So, that was a really fascinating time that sort of showed you the way the government treats anybody who comes out positively about looking into an investigation into the Liberty. And that's what I've argued all along, is that, from ABC, I've covered all these wars and terrible things that have happened all over the world. We've investigated, embassies being blown up in East Africa, the attack on the USS Cole, all these will send FBI agents to foreign countries to find out what really happened. None of that happened with the USS Liberty. That's one of the reasons I've been adamant on this for so long, is because it's one of those things where the U.S. government has deliberately covered up for what, 57 years now.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's fair to ask you to weigh in on the question of whether the attack on the Liberty was really a false flag event that's being attributed to Egypt as a pretext for our going to war against Egypt. But I believe you're attributed with having found the one and only copy of the Northwoods document. And can you clarify the circumstances, either how you found that or how the Assassination Records Research Board found it?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, the Northwoods document, let me just explain what that is. What happened was I was at ABC News, but I was also working on a new book. I was working on Body of Secrets. And so I was interested in the Kennedy assassination. What had happened was that Oliver Stone did a movie called JFK, which raised a lot of questions about the validity of the different reports and investigations that came out about the Kennedy assassination. So the Congress created a law saying that the U.S. government has to release every single document dealing with the JFK assassination, and the only way you can not do that is if the president himself says something can't be released. So they did release a lot of documents, and I had a sort of a source within the people doing the reviews to National Archives, and one of them gave me a document called the Northwoods document. It later became public. I made it public when I got it, but later it became part of the massive documents release. What Northwood's document was, it was extraordinary to me. It still is extraordinary. And what it was the Joint Chiefs of Staff coming up with ways to fool the American public and the world into thinking that Cuba is actually attacking the United States. Because the United States because the Pentagon particularly wanted a reason to attack Cuba. But they weren't giving us any reason. They weren't attacking the United States. They weren't doing anything. They're just sitting there and, growing pineapples or something, but they weren't doing anything hazardous to the United States. So the Pentagon was in a bad position. What are we going to do? How are we going to attack Cuba? It's not attacking us. So they came up with this thing called Operation Northwoods, and this was you can't even really believe it. One of the ideas was that John Glenn was about to go into space, and the idea was if the rocket blew up on the launch pad, killing him, they would put evidence down there showing it was Cuba that actually did that. They had plans to shoot people on streets in the U.S., not necessarily kill them, but shoot them, and blame it on Cuban terrorists. And they just had all these crazy things. One of them was going to be have an airport near Miami where these people were going to get on it, like college students, but they were really CIA people. And there'd be film getting on the plane. The plane would take off and they'd just land like 20 minutes later at another like a CIA airport. And at the same time, another plane would take off that was droned. In other words, nobody on it, but there was a microphone in it. And the idea was it was going to fly over Cuba, and then after it passed Cuba, when it was over the ocean again, they would push a button that would blow up the plane, and then we would blame Cuba for shooting it down. So it was all these insane things. You would think it wouldn't get any higher than, the lunatic whoever wrote it. But it was signed by all 5 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including the chairman. The chairman was a guy named Leominster, General Leominster, and he went to see McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and McNamara, I couldn't find out any more about it. I went through Leominster's papers. I found that he did go see McNamara, but I don't have any record of what happened. But it never got to Kennedy after McNamara, so my assumption is McNamara said, "Are you a lunatic?" And after that, he was no longer chairman of Joint Chiefs. He became head of NATO in Europe, which really wasn't a big demotion. So that was the end of Northwoods. But what it says is that you have to watch what these people do. They're
So did Kennedy never actually see that?
not that I could see, and I went back as far as I could. I don't think McNamara ever went to see Kennedy. I know that it never happened. I mean, they shut it down.
And I've asked Doug Horn, was it Doug Horn at ARRB that found the document?
I can't remember. Somebody gave it to me before it actually became public, and I made it public on ABC News, and then I included it in my book.
Thank you.
But yeah, it's a good lesson in how not to run a government. Yes.
James, you're the expert on this. What do you think about the possibility that a guy like General Edward Lansdale wrote Northwoods?
I wrote about Lansdale a fair amount in the book, and I never put the two together, but he was involved in operations against Cuba and all that.
Mongoose. Operation Mongoose.
Mongoose, yeah, Operation Mongoose. And Robert Kennedy was one of the big, he was basically running Operation Mongoose. I don't know. I mean, the problem is a lot of those documents were destroyed. It was just luck that Northwoods was not destroyed, but a lot of those documents were destroyed. Yeah. Yes.
What's the is the Israeli lobby in the NSA today? Have they infiltrated?
No, not really. NSA has Hebrew linguists, and they keep them separate from other people. We, obviously eavesdrop on Israel. In the most recent book I just wrote, Spy Fail, I have a lot on how we're eavesdropping on the Israeli embassy, for example. I say exactly where it's being done from. It's this obscure building in Maryland and everything. So we know a lot about what they're doing. We just don't do anything about what they're doing. So, but the NSA is sort of apolitical about all that. I mean, they just sit there with earphones on and collect it. But it's the FBI that focuses on the embassy. The argument that I have in the book, or that I make in the book, is that it's obvious what they're doing. I just wrote about all the the activity that's taking place in terms of the students, where the Israeli government is, for one thing, they had an entire sort of a botnet around the United States. What happened was they wanted to get a lot of influence in the United States because the students were agitating against Israel. So they came up with this idea of having an app, a computer app, where all the supporters of Israel, all these students and everything, could download the app. And then once you have the app, then this sort of command center outside of Tel Aviv would send orders over the app saying, for example, I mean, this is a real example I write in my book. There was a cell in Boston, and they didn't like what a church in Boston was having a documentary about Israel, and they didn't like it. So what they would do is they'd send a message back to Tel Aviv saying, this is church, and they're doing this documentary, and it should be in the, we should do something about it. So then the net headquarters outside Tel Aviv would send a message to all the people with the apps saying, hide your connection to Israel, but then complain all about this church, showing this thing, and that's what they did. So I wrote all about it. Other people have written about these things, and nothing's ever done about them. So if you want to read all about it, I wrote all about that stuff just prior to the war in Gaza. So I've been spending the last year or so writing about these things for The Nation magazine, the infiltration, including a cover story in The Nation magazine about how it wasn't Russiagate. There was no Russiagate. Russia didn't infiltrate the United States. The Trump campaign is all nonsense. But the Israelis did. And they sent an agent over to not just infiltrate, but work with the Trump administration secretly. Again, this is a cover story I wrote for The Nation magazine, and I have it in my book. And I got the information from Freedom of Information Act requests to FBI, which did an investigation and got all the telephone records between the Israeli agent and the Trump campaign. But again, there was no investigation. They got the information, but they never prosecuted anybody, never arrested anybody, never did anything. And the mainstream press ignored it, basically. So those things have been going on and on and on. And I'm one of the few people that actually writes about that stuff. So, yes.
Jim, can you talk about Frontlook 615 for Operation Sinai?
What was the first one?
Frontlook 615?
No, I'm not big on Operation Sinai. I don't write about anything that I can't prove. I'm not into conspiracies. I can't say maybe if because of this, that happened. I just don't do that. I can't live in a world like that and exist with credibility. Everything I write about has to be footnoted and backnoted and where it came from. So Operation Northwoods or these eavesdropping, the Israeli activities with their botnets and all that. I can write about it because I have evidence of it. I can prove it. But Operation Cyanide is out of my territory. I mean, other people have written about it, but I can't talk about it because I haven't written about it. Yes. Uh-huh.
What was President Kennedy's relationship with the CIA in
With-
general?
With the CIA?
Yes, when he was president.
Yeah, he didn't trust it. He didn't trust it very well at all because everybody in there had been put in there before he got there. And they didn't like him, and they didn't trust Kennedy, and Kennedy didn't trust them. And Kennedy didn't really... Kennedy was handed this document, the Bay of Pigs. It was created under Eisenhower. I mean, I did all the research on this. I went to the Eisenhower Library and the Kennedy Library, and I looked up all the documents. So Kennedy inherited the Bay of Pigs operation. And the CIA kept saying, you got to do this in April, you got to do it now. You can't wait another couple of weeks because the weather will be this and the weather will be that. So in Kennedy, he regrets it all, for the rest of his life, but he went along with the Bay of Pigs, largely because of the CIA. Now, he had one meeting where he had the CIA and the Pentagon people in there, and General Lemonster, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that came up with Operation Northwoods, knew it was going to be a failure because the CIA can't do this. I mean, they're not military people. They're just, spies or whatever, and they're going to overthrow a country like Cuba with a military operation. So Kennedy said, anybody that disagrees with this operation, doesn't think it's going to be successful, raise your hand. And Lemonster never raised his hand because he was hoping that the CIA would fail at it. And then the Pentagon and the JCS would again rule the roost when it came to coups and that kind of thing, not the CIA. Anyway, that's sort of my take of it.
And why was there a lack of trust between Kennedy and CIA, or distrust?
Well, because Kennedy didn't appoint anybody there. He inherited all those people. he inherited all these operations that he didn't particularly like. And although he was heavily involved with operations in Cuba, his brother ran a lot of them, Operation Mongoose and so forth. But anyway, he didn't trust it, and he trusted even less after Bay of Pigs. That's why he fired Dulles and Alan Dulles and a few other people. Yes.
Mr. Bamford, just curious, have you ever read Jim DiEugenio on JFK's foreign policy? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Read what?
There's an author named James DiEugenio. He writes on the JFK assassination. He focuses on the foreign policy of John F. Kennedy and how it was basically different than anything that Eisenhower or Lyndon Johnson or Richard Nixon did. He was very much more pro-colonialist countries, much less.
My expertise is on.
I was just asking.
Fine. So
asking.
No, I haven't read too much on Kennedy except for what I've talked about. In my reading on Kennedy deals mostly with his intelligence activities and all that. But
what about Dimona? JFK and Dimona in Israel. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've written a fair amount about. I've written actually quite a bit about Dimona in Israel. I just did an article for the Nation magazine on Israel's nuclear activity and all that. So Kennedy wanted to investigate Dimona because Dimona is where Israel developed its nuclear weapons. But the Israelis continually pulled the wool over American eyes, and it wasn't very aggressive. And after Kennedy was killed, Johnson took the opposite viewpoint. He wanted a lot of money from pro-Israeli groups, so he never pushed on looking into Dimona, and it's been there ever since. I've just wrote about it recently. It's been there for so long. There is no controls over it. There are no international controls. That's something that's just waiting to explode, basically. They've got so much buried material there that they don't know what to do with it, nuclear materials. So Dimona is something you've got to really watch. And not only that, if Israel does start going to war with Lebanon and so forth, once, and also with Yemen, with all these drones flying back and forth. It's so dangerous. You're getting drones that can attack Dimona, and then you've got what do you call that place in Russia that blew up the Chernobyl, yeah. So we're in dangerous territory here with what we're doing.
James, we have a lady in the back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Can you touch on the atrocities that there was Egyptians had surrendered, and Israel did all these atrocities,
Right.
just massacring, I think, over 10,000. I don't know how many.
You're talking about during the time of the Liberty.
61. What the USS Liberty uncovered on their radios, whatever they were overhearing.
Right. Yeah, I wrote about that. That's one of the actual things I did write about. Because everybody's looking for an excuse for why did they attack the Liberty. There were numerous potential reasons they attacked. They were going to go after the Golan Heights, which was technically illegal. They shouldn't. It's not their territory. They were capturing somebody else's territory. There were a number of other things, and among them was the fact that it was a foreign country, and they keep secrets during war. They know that if the secret gets out to the USS Liberty, that who knows where it's going to go after that. It could be on the front page of the New York Times or something. So they're very worried about a spy ship 12 miles or 12 and a half miles off their coast. And one of the things that happened to be going on at the same time that I uncovered and wrote about was the Israelis were committing war crimes or killing Egyptians some of them were handcuffed and so forth and being buried in mass graves. So a lot of that was going on around that same time. There were a number of Israelis who spoke about that. So those are among the things that were taking place at the time. And again, nobody else bothered to look into this. The U.S. government never looked into that whole question of what Israel's motivation might have been for attacking the Liberty. But those are some of the areas that I got into in the book. And what am I? Yes.
So, thank you for your talk and for
Sure.
your extensive research you've done. In light of all the research that you've done, yesterday we heard from the Rear Admiral who said, he hasn't seen evidence of a cover-up. Is there a smoking gun? Where do we find the smoking gun? What's the missing piece of information that is needed to sort of get the game over? You're dead.
Well, it's, you find a dead body and there's no investigation, then obviously you could say, well, even though there's a knife sticking out of his chest and the guy left his wallet there, the killer left his wallet there, and you could find that, but there's never been an official investigation. You could say, well, there's never been an official investigation. We'll have an official investigation. The evidence is there. There's no question about it. I've been writing about this stuff for a long time, and I've never been accused of being a conspiracy theorist because I do a lot of research. But it's obvious that they attacked on purpose. There's no real question about the fact that they attacked on purpose. What they're saying is that they, first of all, they didn't see the U.S. flag. The flag was flying. You've got the U.S.'s liberty in big black letters on the back. The numbers are on both sides of the front, and anybody could pick up James fighting ships, and it's like it's right there. It says U.S.'s liberty, basically an American spy ship or eavesdropping ship. So they said they confused it with a horse transport or something that was about half the size or something. And horse transports don't have satellite dishes on the back to communicate, back to the farm or whatever, what the horses are doing. So there were very rare communications facilities that sophisticated on ships at the time. So, and it was buzzed by planes back and forth. They dropped napalm. They shot up the machine gun nest. They shot up the communications facilities, and then they had they had 3 torpedo boats fire 5 torpedoes at the ship. Luckily, they weren't very good. They weren't very accurate. So in one hit, killed the majority of the people who were killed. It NSA operational space. So how can you not have an investigation of that? But Congress will not do that. They say that they did an investigation, but they never did. They've never done. Some I found in the papers of the Liberty Veterans Association. I think you have it on one of your websites. This thing from the General Accounting Office.